Okay, this is the second project management session, and this one's on project organisation, structure and culture. So in this session, what we're looking at is the way the people within the organisation, within the project organisation, are put together in order to deliver the project. Who's involved, what they need to do. We won't be looking in this session at the project leadership. I picked that up later on in the module. And I won't be looking at stakeholders in any detail. I picked that up later on in the module as well. So in this stage, we're just looking at the theory around organisational structure, and then looking at some details of culture within the organisation, project organisation, and some broader, more critical issues towards the end of the session. Okay, so there's reading. That's mostly can be found in chapter 3. Whilst listening to this session, I'd like you to think about these questions. How are people working in projects organised? So you need to have a real sense of the key ways in which people within project organisations are structured, organised. It's quite specific to projects really, so you need to have a good grasp of that. And then how does culture affect the way project teams might work together? Okay, so what are the problems of organising projects? The first one is that they're unique and have a short duration, and this creates issues around projects which you don't find in business as usual type organisations, which are operational and have a long duration. So projects with this short duration, which are unique, have a set of unique activities which are strung together, require a particular kind of organisational structure in order that they can be delivered easily. They're multidisciplinary and cross-functional, so you have lots of different disciplines, lots of different capabilities and skills coming together in one organisational structure, which again makes them different and distinct from more usual organisations, and it creates authority and responsibility dilemmas and problems which project organisations have to try and overcome. We have transients, so people come, do a little bit of their work, deliver their skills or their tasks and their activities, and then they leave. So people and organisations are joining the project organisation and leaving, often throughout the duration of the project. We often have multiple stakeholders, so we have suppliers, clients, customers, end users, so on and so forth. So lots and lots of different vested interests in the project. Now, the challenge for projects is finding the best system that balances the needs of the project with the needs of the organisation. So in talking about organisational structure, towards the end of this section, I'll introduce a quite simple, it looks quite complex in the face of it, but it's quite a simple model which brings all the things I'm going to talk about in structure together. So let's think about project organisational design. We'll start with some of the things which are feeding into the organisation, any organisational design. So the business context and strategy, the role of the company, what the company's trying to achieve, what its objectives are, what its strategy is, key accountabilities, who's responsible for what, and the culture of the organisation. This leads to an organisational strategy. Okay, and this will drive organisational principles, will feed into this as well. This leads to an organisational structure. Now, if you've done organisational theory or organisational behaviour, you'll have come across a lot of different organisational structures and possibly even the matrix structure, which I'll come on to very soon. But here what I'm going to do is talk about it in a lot more detail and how it applies to projects. So we have a lot of things feeding into our decision making around organisational structure. This is driven partly by staffing expectations, who we need, what skills we need, and this leads to individual roles and positions for people within the organisation and a plan. Okay, so we have different types of organisational structure for projects. We have the pure project organisation, functional project organisations, network projects, and I'll talk about each of those briefly, and then come on to, towards the end, the matrix project organisation, which is really a way of thinking about all those three and how they behave. So here we are for project organisation, pure project structure. This is an organisation which carries out its business through projects. So the majority of its business, the majority of its activities will be carried out as projects. This could be a construction company, an engineering company, a consultancy, a film production company. All these organisations, their main business is projects, and they carry out a portfolio of projects. They have a portfolio of projects going on, and the key staff, move from project to project to project. Okay. In these organisations, what you have at the top there is quite a small central structure. So it might have a bit of marketing, a bit of human resources, a bit of finance and administration activities, a bit of legal. But the majority of the activity and the majority of the people within the organisation are employed in projects. So you have project A, project B, project C, project D, and so on and so forth. When a project's finished, the people within that project get redeployed to another project or future projects. And some of those projects will be entirely undertaken within the organisation through using the organisation's own resources. Others will be undertaken using subcontractors and suppliers who can bring specialist skills to the project for a period of time and then leave when the project's completed. Okay, so this kind of structure has a number of advantages. It tends to be quite quick. You can set up a project quite quickly. There's a lot of skills and knowledge. Ultimately, these organisations, their skill base and their capability is around delivering projects. That's what they do. So they can set up projects quite quickly. They have suppliers, cadre of suppliers they can draw upon. They can pull in people very quickly to get a project up and running. So they're quick. Resources are dedicated to a specific project. There's not a huge overhead. It's all driven by the resources, the projects themselves. They're relatively simple in structure. This whole structure is pretty simple and straightforward, and tend to be quite integrated. So the projects, all the requirements of the project are integrated into that project. There are disadvantages, and these are cost of suppliers. Often these kind of project organisations have a whole load of suppliers and specialists who they use to deliver parts of the project, and have quite complex supply chains which are brought together to deliver the project and then dispersed. And this can create all sorts of costs there. Another big problem is knowledge management. One of the things about these projects is that the project managers and the project teams tend to be itinerant. They move around from project to project. They're not really, often not really, don't have much loyalty to the organisation as such. They have loyalty to themselves. They're like mercenaries, moving from project to project. Wherever the next project is, that's where they'll go. So when they do that, they take the knowledge with them, and so the organisation loses that knowledge. They also don't have a great deal of stability. This type of organisation is only as good as its next project, and if suddenly the project stream dries up, the organisation's gone. Okay. It's also relatively expensive. So you have a lot of overhead built in within the projects themselves. So although the overhead's not within the owning organisation, the project organisation, it is within the projects themselves. Okay, functional project structure is where projects happen within an organisation. It could be an organisational change activity, or developing a new product, or something like that. Okay, we have in these kind of structures, different segments of the project are dedicated to different functional units. So different functions within the organisation, a business as usual type of organisation, will then carry out some work dedicated to a particular project. Coordination is maintained normally through existing management channels. It's often used when the interests of one functional area dominates, and where projects are subsidiary to the organisation's main activities. So this will be a lot of organisations out there. I think in when I was talking about this to students, I talked about the university. The university is a big organisation which has its normal day-to-day activities, teaching, research across lots of different schools and departments, but it has also a lot of projects going on, building projects, new programs being developed, old programs being closed down, all sorts of things going on. And these are all kind of projects which are, many of which can be undertaken within the organisation. Okay, so this is the kind of structure you might end up with. So the organisation itself has a big overhead, has lots of activities going on. In this particular example, you have the organisation at the top with human resources and finance and administration, and then a series of functions: marketing, engineering, manufacturing, procurement. Each of these will come together if a project is required, say a new product development, and each of them will have their input into that activity. This is a simpler way of looking at it. So we have a number of silos, functional silos within the organisation, and often the way this works is that the project itself is moved like a pass the parcel from one function to the next, and from that to the next, and from that to the next throughout the organisation. The advantages of this are that the organisation doesn't need to change structurally. Everything remains the same, and the project occurs within the existing organisational structure. You have quality through depth of specialisation. You can draw upon the resource of your particular function and apply that to the project if needed. You have easier post-project transition. So because the project's happening within the organisation, then the organisation can absorb the outputs of the project into the organisation generally reasonably easily. This last point is a bit of an ambiguous one, really, a dubious one. It's possible to hide project costs. By this I mean that the costs of the project get lost within the general activities of the functions which are carrying out the project. This means that projects often can happen which might otherwise not happen. That's important to organisations because they need to change, and projects are about delivery of change within organisations. If they don't change, they through project activities, then they ossify, they get overtaken by their competitors. So change is important, and that can be delivered through projects, but projects often don't happen because as soon as the real budgets and the costs of the projects are recognised, then strategically you say, well, we can't justify going ahead with this project. So often projects get stopped because of cost issues or time issues, which get hidden in this kind of functional project organisation. The disadvantages are it's slow. You're moving the project from point to point to point. Different functions are having their input, going away, thinking about what needs to be done next, having their input, going away. It's very difficult to integrate the different functions. Who has priority, who has responsibility. And there's a lack of focus. Focus is on business as usual activities, and so attention is being drawn away from those business as usual activities to the project, and this means that often that focus is not necessarily clear. And finally, a lack of ownership. Who's in charge? Maybe it's one of the functions. Maybe it's a separate external project manager who's brought in to make this project happen. Maybe it's somebody within the organisation who's dedicated to has project skills and is dedicated to project delivery. All sorts of but ultimately it's difficult. The problem here is who's in charge. Okay, and the final one I'm going to talk about briefly are network projects. This is where often you have, this is often used for product development, where you have some sort of hub company, a company which wants to deliver something, and it brings in skills and resources from lots of other organisations who may themselves have a stake in delivery of the project. The advantages of this, cost reduction. The cost is spread throughout organisations, and each organisation can bring some skills to the project. There's a high level of expertise in these kind of projects, and flexibility. Disadvantages, who coordinates. At the moment you have one hub project, but then that may shift or move around depending on how the project progresses. In doing so, you can lose control, and there's often conflict in these kind of projects. Disagreements, arguments, and no clear ownership of or person in charge or leading the project who has authority to lead that project. Okay, so all these projects I talked about all these project structures are underpinned by a matrix structure. Essentially what you have is a series of project teams and each project team draws resources, maybe in this case, from different functions of the organisation, or it could be different suppliers or different skill groups or different capabilities within the organisation or from outside the organisation that are all being brought together in order to deliver the project. Now, what you can see here is the project team is spread across those different functions or activities, and the project team leader will be trying to coordinate their roles on the project. This is what is often called the two-boss problem. Who's in charge? The person from the function, or the person, the boss from the function, or the boss in the project manager. Okay, this creates major problems and major challenges for projects, and I'll talk about that later on in this. Okay, so the advantages of the matrix form: close coordination where decisions may conflict. So the project becomes the environment within which decisions are made. Okay, it adapts to specific strategic situations. So project organisations are adaptable and flexible. Bureaucracy is replaced by direct discussion. You get people into a room, into specifically or physically meeting to talk about problems and issues. And there's increased managerial involvement. You have a dedicated project manager who's responsible for delivering the project, and they can control and provide the managerial requirements that the project needs. There are also downsides to the matrix form. So there's conflict. The matrix structure internalises conflict between organisational needs and environmental pressures. So what this means is that the organisation has particular needs which are being delivered through the project, hopefully, but there's environmental pressures pulling the project in different directions, and this creates conflict. Stress. The two-boss problem creates a huge amount of stress for individuals working within the project environment. I'll come back to that point later. There's a balance of power issue. Who's in charge? Is it the project manager, or is it the organisation, the functional manager, or the manager of a supplier, or the manager of a subcontractor? Who's in charge? Finally, the whole matrix structure is a very costly structural form. It's not very efficient, it's not very effective, but frankly is the main way in which projects can be, the only way really, in which projects can easily be delivered. Okay. The reference to the matrix organisation was Knight's paper in the Journal of Management Studies in 1976. That's a very early paper which looks at this issue. Okay, we have three different types of matrix really. The weak matrix, where the project manager is coordinating input into the project, but in these kind of situations there's little commitment to success. Strong matrices, where departments or subcontractors, suppliers second people on a full-time basis to the project. There's a strong commitment to these kind of projects, but this draws resource away from departments and suppliers. And then the balanced matrix, which is where the project manager sets the overall plan and the functional manager decides, or the supplier or the subcontractor decides how work will be done, and this creates conflict, stress, pulling in two directions, the two-boss problem. Often, and in reality, we have very complex structures where we have large projects going on, drawing on lots of different functions, small projects which or projects which are externalized, joint venture partners getting involved in projects, all sorts of things going on. You can look at something like the university again, and a university like Birmingham University will have big internal projects going on, IT projects going on, some of which will be internal and have functional activities going on, some which will have suppliers, and then buildings. The buildings and structures which are being built on campus are pretty much all carried out by external suppliers and engineers and architects who come in and then are coordinated by a project manager from the university. So there's lots of complexity going on within most large organisations which have projects going on as well as business as usual activities. Okay, so there's a lot I've talked about there, and the way to think about this is to think about some of the key issues around the appropriate way of structuring your project organisation. So we have organisational considerations. How important is the project to the firm's success? How strategic is it? What percentage of the core work of the organisation involves project activity, and what level of resources are available within the organisation to deliver a project? These are key issues which an organisation will think about. And then we have project considerations. How big is the project? How important is it strategically? Again, novelty and need for innovation, which could be really important to the organisation, or the project might be just a small activity which is important but isn't particularly novel or particularly innovative. How much integration is involved? How many departments are going to be involved? How many suppliers? How many subcontractors are going to be involved? In other words, what sort of capabilities are required to deliver the activities which are needed to deliver the project? How much environmental complexity is there? There are lots of external interfaces, lots of stakeholders. What are the budget and time constraints? Are these very tight? Are these more relaxed? Is there contingency or isn't there contingency? And also stability of resource requirements. And this leads us to this model. This is quite a neat model, which you can find in any of the various editions of this book by Nicholas and Stein. And this little model has 2 dimensions on each axis. So on the x-axis, we've got occurrence at the bottom. How frequently are projects carried out within the organisation? Are they fairly unusual within the organisation? Are they very infrequent? Or are projects happening all the time? And this will vary over time for an organisation. So again, looking at the University of Birmingham, I guess a long time ago, 50 years ago, 80 years ago, there wasn't probably a great deal of projects occurring on campus. Everything was pretty stable. Over the last 20 years or so, lots of things have been going on. Lots of new buildings have been built, lots of new programs are being set up and to be delivered. And so lots of projects are going on all the time now. And so within the Birmingham University, there's a lot of projects that are a common occurrence, happening all the time. Then the one above that on the x-axis is duration. Are the projects which are occurring short term or long term? And so if projects are infrequent, are they short term and long term? If projects are commonplace, are they short term or long term? And so that's the x-axis. On the y-axis, we have 2 dimensions as well, complexity and size. And broadly, these are corresponding. So the view is that small projects will be fairly simple, large projects will be fairly complex. That isn't always the case, but for simplicity's sake, for the purpose of this model, that's what we're assuming. And it is often the case. So if a project's small and simple, it doesn't matter if it's a long project or a short project, whether projects are commonplace within the organisation or infrequent within the organisation. What you will end up in this happening here is a single function will normally lead the project and will have some sort of task force or team to deliver the project. The structure will be quite simple and be driven by one particular function who will draw on specific capabilities and skills as and when needed. They'll be brought into the project and then leave. So most of the project activities will happen within a function. So a very simple kind of structure. Where you have more complexity, then we have some more complex structures happening. So with medium complexity, medium-sized projects, where those projects are long duration but unusual to the organisation, you might have a temporary matrix structure put in place. Where the projects are short duration but of medium complexity, you might have a multifunctional task force called team put together, which is brought together specifically to deliver the project and then disperses. Where you have large projects happening within an organisation, but they're infrequent projects, the organisation might set up a project centre somewhere within the organisation, or even outside the organisation, tasked to deliver the project and procure the resources wherever they're needed from, maybe within the organisation, maybe external to the organisation. Where projects are more commonplace in the organisation, so this is frequent projects happening within the organisation, but those projects are short term, of medium complexity, then a multifunctional task force again would normally be put together to deliver that kind of project. Where we have long duration projects and they're happening all the time, a permanent matrix is put in place. We have a dedicated project team or project office within the organisation whose job is to deliver projects all the time and to provide capabilities and skills for all these different projects which are happening within the organisation or across the organisation. Went the wrong way there. And then finally, where projects are happening frequently and they're of relatively long duration, well, this is normally a pure project organisation. This is a project organisation and all they do is carry out projects, and that is where you find that pure project organisation. The big consultancies, the big construction company, or any construction company really, architects, engineering companies, those sort of organisations, film companies will all be up there. Okay, so there we are. That's a neat model for thinking about what kind of structure we might apply to what kind of project environment. Okay, so I'm going to try and blend this or segue this into culture, this discussion around structure. So I want to talk briefly about structure and culture. Organisational structure and organisational culture have a dependent relationship. By that I mean, if it's a hierarchical structure, it tends to be centralised, there's a top-down decision-making approach, and culture will reflect the lack of freedom and autonomy that derives from that at lower levels within the organisation. We have decentralised structures, power tends to be shared, and authority also tends to be shared. And because of that, you have more independent, personalised and accountable cultures within these kind of structural arrangements. Now, both can happen within projects. The important thing so what do we mean by project culture? Let's think about that briefly. So culture could be within the supporting sponsor organisation or supporting organisation. That has a culture, and that can be a factor in the culture of the project. When we have culture within projects, so we have culture within projects. Projects form their own culture. It's a group who hopefully are cohesive, they're brought together and they're delivering the project, and in doing so, especially over a long duration, a culture will develop within that project. And finally, we have project cultures across ecosystems, project ecosystems. So from one project to another, cultures get transferred. So we have this is the way we do projects, which may be different to this is the way we do business within the organisation. So I've talked about culture briefly here. What do we mean by culture? Here's a nice quote. Culture is a fuzzy set of basic assumptions and values, orientations to life, beliefs, policies, procedures and behavioural conventions that are shared by a group of people and that influence, but do not determine, each member's behaviour and his or her interpretations of the meaning of other people's behaviour. So there's a lot going on in that. It's about groups of people coming together. They share understandings and beliefs and ways of viewing the life and values and systems and some assumptions. They share these things. People coming into this group become acculturalised. People leaving the group take that culture with them. Okay, and then within that organisation, their behaviour is influenced by that culture. It also means they can understand other people's behaviour through interpreting the meaning of that behaviour through a cultural lens. This is a nice quicker quote. Ellen Valich said, "Organisational culture is like pornography. It's harder to find, but you know it when you see it." And I think that's very true. Okay, Shine has a classic model which I'm going to mention here. It's normally shown as a onion model with an outside layer and layer within that, and then a layer in the centre, a core. but I've shown it as a up-down model like this. So the bottom is the core, the top is the outside layer. At the top we have, or let's start in the middle, the core. We have basic assumptions, views on the nature of reality, time, space, nature of human activity, nature of relationships. These are what Schein said were taken for granted, invisible, pre-conscious ways of viewing the world, which are driven all the way from our childhood. They're essentially our ontology, our way of viewing the world. This takes expression in a set of values, which then in turn takes expression in what we create, what we produce, what we see, what we do. So visible and audible patterns of behaviour, technology, art, all these sort of things are expressions of our culture. These are visible, the outside, the artefacts and creations are visible but often not decipherable. But it's only through those, what we can see, that we can make any assumptions or infer the cultures of the people we're looking at. So what does organisational culture do? It's important. It creates boundaries. It conveys a sense of identity for groups within an organisation. It facilitates a generation of commitment to aims above self-interest. Okay, so we're committed to the aims of the organisation rather than our own self-interest. Of course, we're self-interested as well. As individuals within organisations, we all have our self-interests. We want to earn money and to have a good life and do various things, but we also have a commitment to the aims of the organisation. We believe in the organisation. We feel loyalty or sense of loyalty to the organisation. It enhances the social system stability, so people work together, feel like they're working together, and can point to other people within the organisation and say, that's somebody like me. Okay? It's also about sense making and creating a control mechanism. So within organisations, if you're new to an organisation, it's often difficult to understand what's going on. With time, you start to understand what happens, how things happen, who does what, and so forth. It's also a control mechanism in the sense that it exerts control upon people. People internalise that control through culture. Importantly, this is an important point, there is no one best culture. There's no clear link between performance and culture. The greyed out YouTube addresses at the bottom there are to two videos, one about Apple, one about Star Wars and the Death Star. Watch those if you wish. Two different approaches, two different cultural ways of seeing the world. Apple, they're fairly autonomous, fairly decentralised, lots of decision making, high capability people. In Star Wars or any military or hierarchical culture, it's very top-down decision making. People do what they're told. Okay, so let's think about the people who are going to be introduced into the organisational culture. Who are we going to have in a project team? What we're looking for are characteristics of that team. So the key factor is individual members of a project team. Often project teams, even for large projects, are relatively small, and they have a group of people who come together. They may be representatives of different functions within an organisation, or different suppliers, or different subcontractors, or a mixture of all those things, and they've been brought together to work together as within a project, on a project. So their individual characteristics are important. What do we look for? We look for technical competence. Can they do the job they're required to do? Are they able to complete the activity? Political sensitivity. Are they able to understand, that's with a small p, by the way, are they able to understand the politics surrounding the project, the sponsoring organisation's politics, the politics of different stakeholders that may be involved in the project? Are they able to solve problems? This is important because projects are a step into the unknown. They're about not doing things which haven't been done before. They're unique activities, remember. So often they involve lots of problem solving, and so the people involved in the project need to have a problem orientation. You need goal orientation as well. Projects are time delimited, they have an objective, and you need to work towards that goal. These individuals often need to have high self-esteem. So they need to be able to have confidence in themselves and their own abilities, and without huge amounts of social support, which they might otherwise have in different organisational settings. And importantly, they have the ability to deal with the two bosses problem: who's in charge, and deal with the stress that derives from that two boss problem. Often, I'm sad to say, they're chosen by default. You're available, you will work in this project. Okay, Tuchman came up with this very, very useful model, which he talks about as a team cohesiveness. Okay, so he argued that teams or groups of people come together to form a team. At the early stages, they are in a forming stage. They're getting to know each other. They're working out what they have to do. Their performances on their task is quite low. Over time, that performance will hopefully increase, but then they'll start to do what he calls storming, which is they'll start to fight, conflicts will start to arise as they try to work out what the task involves, who's in charge, where authority lies, and which direction they're going in. As things start to settle within the team, they'll get to a stage which Tuchman called norming, where norms of behaviour, cultural norms start to become embedded within the organisation, and then performance improves again, and then ultimately they get to a stage which he called performing, which is where everything is just ticking over quite nicely. Now, this model was not necessarily devised for projects, but makes sense in projects. Now, if you think about it, projects are time delimited. You have to go from the forming stage to the performing stage very, very quickly. The added complication to this is that you have transients. People come into the project and then leave the project when their activity is completed. So there's a danger that you go all the way back to the beginning, to the forming stage, or the performance gets reduced as people leave the project and new people join the project. So it creates all sorts of problems for the organisation. This is a very, very useful model for understanding what's going on in projects. It brings together the individuals within the projects with a sense of culture, because over time, as culture is settled within the organisation, then people within the organisation are able to perform. If that culture is continually disrupted, as you often find in projects, then nothing is settled, nothing is organised, there's continual conflict, and the performance is never as effective as you might wish. Okay, Anderson came up with this idea of building project teams. He saw two aspects. One is structural. We talked about structure. So it's the organisational structure, i.e., in other words, project team matrix, that is the organisational structure for projects, and selection and design. Also, it's about team resources, what resources have we got available to us, and about goals and expectations which are imposed upon the project team. There are also social and cultural factors. So there's an issue around group cohesiveness, how cohesive are the people within the group, what sort of propensity do they have to cohere together as a group. We also have the composition, the people involved in the project. Now, often this is neglected, but if you look at the work of Belbin or the Myers-Briggs model, then these are ways of thinking about getting the right people together to deliver the project. You can't have everyone as a project leader, can't have everyone as a project follower. You need a mix of people. That's what Belbin said. It's also about recognition and rewards to the team. What sort of rewards are you getting as a consequence of being part of the project? And it's also about team leadership and sponsorship. Who's the person in charge? Who's driving the project? What sort of support are you getting from outside the project? Okay, this is just a diagram illustrating the two bosses problem. It's important. This is I mentioned it a number of times, and it's a real crucial issue. So I'm going to talk about this a little bit through some research which I've been involved in or done. So this is a nice quote from Oshery. He wasn't actually talking about project actors, but I've applied the word project actors because I think this quote really applies to people working in projects. So project actors in the two boss problem find themselves in what Oshery called the typical middle pattern. They become torn, weak, ineffective, unable to satisfy anyone adequately, and disempowered individually and collectively. It's a very, very nice quote because it suggests that people within projects face the inability to know quite where their loyalty should lie. Who's in charge? What should I do? Should I be working all guns blazing for the project manager? Should I be concentrating on what my boss within my organisation or my function tells me? Who's in charge? It's a real problem with matrix structures. So it's around conflict between organisational and functional authority and project authority. It's about constant jockeying for power and control. The project manager's trying to pull resources to his project or her project. They are responsible for project delivery and and that's their focus. The organisation or the function doesn't want to lose its capabilities and resource, so it's pulling resources back into the function, and the person seconded to the organisation, to the project, or asked to work on the project is being pulled by this tension. Many projects are, as I've mentioned before, subject to continual transition throughout the project life cycle. So you have people coming in and leaving, and this creates all sorts of problems with the project. And this is a model which I put together as part of a paper. You can see the paper's down there. It's presented at a journal a few years back, in a conference a few years back, about trying to illustrate this tension. Okay, so that's the end of this session. And what have I talked about? So various organisational approaches are employed to deliver projects depending on the nature of the organisation delivering the project, and also the nature of the project within the organisation. But all these organisational approaches have something in common, which is a matrix structure is used. The precise form depends on the complexity, size, frequency and duration of projects within the organisation, and that model I discussed earlier tries to illustrate these factors. Structure and culture are closely linked. Projects exist within a cultural milieu and themselves have a culture. So we need to think about the culture of the project and the culture of the organisation, which is trying to deliver the project. The composition of the project team is a crucial aspect of project culture. And when you're thinking about the team, the people within the project, the way the project's structured and organised, what you might want to consider is the ways in which project structures and culture might descend into dysfunction, with people being pulled in multiple directions.